So as we get started, I think it's good to get a nice overview of what we look at when we talk about plants. So the diversity of land plants. This includes, today's conversation is basically the kinds of things that we call plants and the major ways that these different plant groups can differ from each other. So before we get started, I know you all are interested and excited about plants, but if you weren't and you had, maybe trouble being convinced that plants were important, this is an image that shows the relative mass of organisms on Earth. And you can see that big green block, plants. And that tiny little bit down there is animals and humans. So gray block for animals, a little bit of slice for humans, big old chunk of plants. So this relates to, of course, the trophic levels that you've learned about in your ecology classes. So plants as these, we call them primary producers. They are the food for the other organisms. So if those other organisms are going to be alive, then they need stuff to eat. And there are more plants out there than the animals eat. So they kind of make whatever the animals take up for space, the plants have to take up lots more, as we can see here. That makes plants very important for all things global. So from climate change, we talk about the deforestation and the number of plants on Earth as being important for the health of the global climate. This is important for everyone. Obviously having food for us, food for animals, this is important also. So plants, just phenomenally important if you didn't already know. So this is from a study not too long ago that just attempted to sort of quantify the mass of these organisms on Earth. Another way to look at the diversity of life. So this is not everything that's photosynthetic. This one focuses in on actually a little bit skewed towards the diversity of animals, which is this group called metazoa in purple. So not relative diversity here, but just a little bit more skewed to organisms that maybe caught the eye of researchers a little bit more. So as humans, we tend to study animals on average a little bit more, I think. So we'll ignore those in this class and focus in on these other groups. Fungi, this slice here, fungi are closely related to animals, so they're actually not so related to plants, not as closely related to plants as they are to animals. But we will talk about fungi. They kind of get a mention in this class. Simply they need to get mentioned somewhere, and they're not going to get covered in the animal class. They have a lot of features in common with plants, but they are not in the plant group, and they are not actually terribly closely related to plants. One group of fungi that will be maybe a little more interesting to us is this group called the lichens, and the lichens have an association with photosynthetic organisms. So they have kind of this fungal matrix, and inside of that are algae or cyanobacteria that can do photosynthesis and actually give them the benefits of photosynthesis in that process. Over here, a slice of bacteria, and actually turns out that there are photosynthetic bacteria. So in this bacterial slice, one part of that are the cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae. I much prefer the term cyanobacteria for them because that term reminds us that they are in fact bacteria, and they are pretty distantly related from the ones we more properly call algae. So particularly the green algae will get some mention in this class. And green algae, as you can see, are distant relatives of the cyanobacteria. In fact, cyanobacteria, very distant from everything else here, starting in these, all the way here and throughout. Those are eukaryotic cells, and then the bacteria would be prokaryotic cells lacking a nucleus. So I mentioned the algae. The green algae are in this group called the Archaeplastida, and also in Archaeplastida, but a distinct and noteworthy lineage from within Archaeplastida are the land plants. So the plants that we're going to study in this class, when we say plants, we're actually talking about land plants. And so this is the meat. You talk about plants as meat. The meat of the plant kingdom are the plants, land plants. All right, so we have a variety of organisms that are able to do photosynthesis. So I mentioned that lichens are basically have a fungal matrix, and inside of that are photosynthetic organisms. They're so closely intertwined in there that we think of them as one thing. So this lichen is two organisms, at least two very distantly related organisms, and they're working together. They have a similar appearance, and they actually are going to disperse together, as we'll see a little bit later. So lichens, we kind of talk about them as organisms. They can do photosynthesis. Green algae can do photosynthesis. A couple of these are in the actually land plant group. So mosses and ferns are members of the land plant group. And then cyanobacteria, as I mentioned, those are able to do photosynthesis. So if we zoom in on the land plants, there are four big groups of land plants. And these are ones that we're going to focus on and talk about their diversity. And they are differentiated from each other by the features that they have or don't have relative to each other. So we can kind of work our way up from simpler to more complex. This group here has the mosses, the hornworts, and the liverworts, otherwise collectively known as the bryophytes. And those are also known as the non-vascular land plants. So they are land plants, but they don't have the ability to transmit water for long distances. So we tend to see these as small organisms growing close to the ground, shady spots close to water. In general, there are some of these that can handle harsher environments, but in general, these are organisms that do well where it is cool, dark, and moist. You certainly probably can think of a place where you've seen mosses in your life. These other groups are a little bit harder to find, the liverworts and the hornworts, but lots of mosses in the world. You're never really too far from a moss, I would say. Moving up in complexity, we'll skip over to the right, top right here, the seedless vascular plants. So I like to refer to them by these terms that tell us one thing that they have compared to the other groups, and one thing they're missing compared to the other groups. So this is a group of plants that are now vascular. They have water conducting cells. That means they can be taller, a little bit farther from the water in the soil, but they do not have seeds. So these reproduce by spores, as we will see. And in this group are the ferns, the lycophytes, horsetails, things like that. Moving up in complexity, we have two plant groups that have seeds. So the non-flowering seed plants and the flowering plants. The non-flowering seed plants, you can guess that they do not in fact have flowers. They have cones or naked seeds, nothing we would call flowers, but their reproduction is sometimes a little bit almost flower-like, almost fruit-like. Includes the conifers, the cycads. This is one called ephedra. And then finally, the flowering plants, the one that gets the most attention. This is the most diverse, the most colorful group of land plants, and deservedly so. It's a pretty cool group of plants, and ones we'll probably spend most of our time in this semester talking about. The flowering plants, which are also the fruiting plants. So flowers and fruits produced exclusively by the flowering plants. Flowering plants also known as the angiosperms, and then the non-flowering seed plants also known as the gymnosperms. So I think if you're a phylogenetic thinker, this might be helpful for you to see. We don't do a lot of phylogeny in this class, but I think you're getting more and more exposure to phylogeny in your other classes. It's a field that's really taken off, and it's a really helpful way to understand diversity. So we can't cover diversity and not talk about phylogenies. So what this shows are groups that have common ancestors and descendants from that ancestor. So this big box with the dotted red line in it, those are all the flowering plants that were sampled in this study. And they have a common ancestor here. So this would be an ancestral single flowering plant. Somebody millions of years ago came up with the idea of flowers and fruits. And that plant was very successful and went on to diversify and become all these different groups of plants that we have today. But they basically have a single ancestor, a single original flowering plant way back when. Similarly, the gymnosperms have a single common ancestor if you trace them back. And so that group has diversified, as I mentioned, into the conifers. These here are conifers, also cycads, ginkgo, if you're familiar with it. This is an image of some ginkgo leaves and seeds. The ferns are distinct from the lycophytes. I've just used the terminology, the seedless vascular plants for both of those. I think we'll probably just treat them together. You may not have heard of lycophytes before this class, so I don't want to get us into terrible much detail in the lycophytes, but they can be distinct from the ferns. Ferns and lycophytes, the seedless vascular plants, also including the horsetails in this group Equisetum or Equisetidae. All right, and then bryophytes, common ancestor of bryophytes, giving rise to the mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. So the groups we're going to talk about are groups that have almost all, with the exception of the ferns and the lycophytes, descended from a common ancestor. So they have a lot in common, and they are worth talking about as a group, I guess. That's one way to think of it. All right, so if we go way back, we talk about land plants. What was there before there were land plants? And I really enjoy this. It's kind of a thought experiment, right? What did the earth look like before there were land plants? There were plants, there had been plants, or photosynthetic organisms, I should say. There were organisms doing photosynthesis for millions of years before this happened, but they were in the water, right? So if you're in the water, you're not really at risk of drying out. You get out of the water, you've got a chance of drying out. You've got much more harsh sun exposure. There's gas exchange to worry about. So oxygen was not initially super abundant in the atmosphere. So having the right gases and the ability to use those gases in photosynthesis or respiration, that's not something that just came naturally necessarily to these organisms. So before the ancestors of the plants crawled out onto land, there was really nothing there. So probably some cellular algae, or I mean, there was probably a decent amount of organisms on land, but nothing big. So nothing all that multicellular, nothing really tall. So you would look out on this big barren wasteland. Obviously this is an artist's reconstruction, but pretty similar to what you might have seen early on as plants are getting established on land, growing close to the water, kind of building their way, building structures, evolving structures that allow them to get farther away from the water. Not too different from what we saw in animals, right? So if you think about animals crawling out of the ocean, we have vertebrate animals making it onto land, invertebrates making it onto land. That's another way I like to think about this, is before there were plants on land, there was really not a lot of reason an animal would want to get out of the water, right? So if you were an ancestral fish, getting the ability to go onto land, it's only worthwhile if there's something to eat up there. Maybe a nice hiding place, but certainly a big incentive for animals to get out of the water if they had some plants to eat on land. On the right-hand side, these are some algae, green algae relatives of land plants. They're kind of the closest algae relatives of land plants. And as you can see, very diverse still, those different groups of algae.